In today's video, I'm going to walk you guys through all the steps to reassemble that factory intake manifold assembly. It's not just the aluminum intake manifold you need to worry about. There's actually a bunch of components that you need to install on this intake manifold, and you need to make sure you do it in a certain order. And in today's video, I'm going to walk you guys through all the steps to reassemble that intake manifold assembly, and I'm going to go ahead and install it on my EJ-205 engine. Thanks so much for checking out the video, guys, and thanks so much for joining me in my little Subaru-only shop here in Northern California. My name's Luke, and this is the Subaru-only show. This is my little Subaru-only shop. It's a DIY Subaru channel. It's a channel where all I do is Subaru builds and race Subaru vehicles in motorsport events. It's a DIY themed channel where I walk you guys through the steps to get your Subarus back on the road and hopefully do a little racing of your own. So thanks for checking out the video, guys. I really appreciate it. Okay guys, there's actually a bunch of steps in this process and a bunch of different components that you need to install onto this intake manifold. So to make it a little bit easier and to help us visualize all the steps that are involved in this process, I actually went ahead and grabbed my whiteboard and I put 6 key steps up on that whiteboard. And before we get started assembling this intake manifold assembly, I'm going to walk you guys through each one of those 6 steps. The first step is the TGVs, and that stands for tumble generator valves. You're actually going to install the tumble generator valves with new gaskets on this intake manifold first. And then the second step is that air intake. At this point, it's a good idea to go ahead and bolt in that air intake. And then the third step here is the fuel lines. The hard fuel lines actually bolt up to the underside of the intake manifold. And then number 4 is the wiring harness. In addition to the fuel lines, you also have the wiring harness that's installed underneath the intake manifold. You need to make sure you install this wiring harness after you've done these first 3 steps. And number 5 is actually installing the fuel rails and injectors. I'm going to show you guys how to do that when we get there. And then number 6 is installing all those evaporative lines. These are actually all the emissions lines that capture all the vapors in your fuel system. There's a bunch of these evap lines and a little purge solenoid you have to install on this intake manifold if you want to be completely compliant and if you want to have all the factory emissions components installed on your engine. Step 1 is installing the TGVs or the tumble generator valves. Now I've actually cleaned up these TGVs by spraying them with some aluminum mag wheel cleaner and then scrubbing them with a wire brush and then rinsing them with clean water. And this is basically what my final finish is. It's not perfect, it's not anywhere near as good as media blasting, but if you're at home and all you got is a little bit of cleaner and a wire brush, this is actually a pretty decent finish. And it's a hell of a lot better than leaving it all grimy and greasy and all full of that white oxidation that was caked all over it before. So this sucker looks a hell of a lot better, and it's going to look really nice against that red wrinkle coat paint that's on the intake manifold. Now anytime you're going to install a set of TGVs, you always want to make sure you use a new set of gaskets. These are a set of gaskets from Grimspeed. I've used these plenty of times. They're high quality. And incidentally, I'll point out those gaskets often come in a set. I actually have 2 sets, but you only need 1 set when you're connecting those TGVs to your intake manifold. And then go ahead and grab that gasket and line it up with those studs and drop it down on it and install it on your intake manifold. And when you go to install this TGV, you're going to notice there's actually 2 studs that'll help you align it with that intake manifold. So start with those 2 studs. They're on the outside of those TGVs. First one's right here and the other one's right here. So you can start with lining these studs up and putting those through the holes and using the little nuts, which I believe are little 10mm nuts. And then for these other 4 holes right here, 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 and here, those are actually going to use little bolts. I actually have a box full of new bolts. This is a zinc plated bolt. It's just as good as that factory OEM quality bolt. It's the same grade or higher, and it's going to look great with that new red intake manifold paint. So go ahead and line this sucker up and drop it on those studs and get a couple of those bolts and get them started as well. Alright, I'll get those little nuts on. I'm not going to do anything super tight yet. I'm just going to go ahead and snug everything down. And then I'll torque it down at the end when I have both these suckers installed. Alright, and there's the first TGV. That sucker's completely installed. I'm going to go ahead and move over to the other side. It's always good practice when you're bolting anything up that has a machine surface. You start from the inside and work your way out. Alright, boom. Go ahead and get that last nut installed, and you're good to go. Okay, and for these little suckers, you only torque these suckers down to about 6.1 foot-pounds. So go ahead and grab your torque wrench and torque that sucker down to about 6.1 foot-pounds. Alright, we are done with the first step, the TGV, so I'm going to go ahead and put a little check there. I'll move on to the next step, which is installing the air intake. Okay guys, to install the air intake, we're actually going to flip this intake manifold around. That way it's kind of the same orientation as it is in the engine bay. And another thing I want to show you guys is this really quick and easy fix that I came up with to repair a rip in your intake manifold. It's a really common thing that happens right here where that hose clamp is installed. That hose clamp actually has a bit of a serrated edge on it, and over time, the pressure and a little bit of vibration with that hose clamp can actually wear a rip or put a hole right at that soft rubber point where it slips over your turbo inlet. This is actually a hole that developed from that hose clamp that was installed on it. And this is actually my fix. It's a simple and inexpensive repair for a torn air intake, and all it is a silicone bracelet. It's about a 1/2 inch wide, and it's got an 8-inch circumference. This little sucker actually fits perfectly over that air intake, and when you put a hose clamp over the silicone, it actually helps cinch the silicone down over the hole or the rip. So what the idea here is you basically grab that silicone band and you install it right over that spot where that hose clamp usually cinches down. Just like this. This 1/2 inch wide hose clamp is actually the perfect width to sit in that little groove where that hose clamp sits. And in addition to sealing a ripped or torn air intake, this little silicone band will actually prevent a good air intake from developing a rip or a hole at a later time. So I gotta be honest guys, getting one of these little silicone bands is something anybody should do on any car that's really running any of these air intakes that has a soft rubber material for that connection point to that turbo, because it's really common for those hose clamps to cut through them and develop a hole in them. And as you guys can see, they make them in black, so you're not even gonna notice it once everything's reinstalled. Basically, this is a really simple and easy step. For the air intake, all you're going to do is line up this mark right here. You're going to put one little bolt, and you're just going to kind of loosely thread that bolt in. We're not going to crank it down at all right now, but we do want to have this air intake lightly bolted down. And like I said, this is a pretty simple process. Just go ahead and loosely install that bolt to hold that air intake in place while we go ahead and move on to the next steps. Okay, and we are done with step number 2, install that air intake. So I'm going to put a check by that sucker and move on to step number 3, which is installing those hard fuel lines. Now that we have these TGVs installed on this awesome red intake manifold, and we've used that new hardware to install it, we can actually move on to the next step, which is installing these hard lines. These fuel hard lines actually bolt up to the bottom of this intake manifold. The first step is that you're going to start with this left fuel rail and fuel line assembly. Install the sucker first, and then lightly snug down the bolts. That'll be the first step. I'm going to walk you guys through that right now. Okay, to install this left side fuel rail assembly, you're going to start by weaving this side of the hard line around to the back side of this intake manifold, like this. Then go ahead and grab your bolts and install them through those holes. And as you guys have probably noticed, I'm using a lot of new hardware on this engine. These bolts are new bolts and they've been zinc coated, which is a really good treatment that resists surface corrosion. So I'll go ahead and install these nice, brand new zinc coated bolts, and I'll just kind of snug them down lightly. Okay, and bam, that first left side fuel rail is completely installed, and we'll go ahead and move on to the rest of these fuel line assemblies and that right side fuel rail. Okay, so next we're going to install the rest of these fuel lines in that right side fuel rail assembly. And if you don't know the steps to install this whole assembly as one unit, it can definitely be a pain in the ass, and it could easily end up scratching that brand new paint job on that intake manifold. But I'll tell you guys right now, it's actually not that tricky, and you can definitely install this whole assembly on that intake manifold with very little scratching. And here's a trick. You're going to start by weaving this side through this portion of your intake manifold so that this hole right here lines up with the bolt location right here on your intake manifold. That's the first step, and to do that, you want to go ahead and grab your intake manifold and lift it up to almost a near vertical position, and then weave this portion through that little gap right here. And we'll go ahead and do that right now. Lift that intake manifold up, just kind of gently get it oriented right, and it should pop right up in there. And once it pops in there, we'll go ahead and work on the right side fuel rail. Okay, once you're able to get those fuel lines through that gap on the left side, you can go ahead and move over to the fuel rail on your right side. Now this sucker might also seem kind of complicated, but if you walk through the right steps, it's actually not that difficult. We just got to get this fuel rail so it can bolt down to these two holes right here. And to do that, you want to go ahead, lift your fuel rail up, and then go ahead, pull that fuel line and fuel rail assembly over to the front of the intake manifold, and then just kind of slip it around up and over those little ports for your fuel injectors. And you should be able to slip this thing over and line it up with those holes so you can put a bolt in there and hold it in place. Just like that. And I'll go ahead and grab one of those new zinc plated bolts and I'll loosely install it to hold everything in place. Okay, the next thing you want to do is go ahead and attach these two fuel rail assemblies. You want to work this hose over this little barbed hard line and connect it with that hose clamp. You might have to loosen up those bolts quite a bit to get enough play in there so you can slide that rubber end over that hard line. So go ahead and get that sucker connected before you move on to the next step. You want to make sure you can feel the little ridge from the barb on that hard line. That way you can put the hose clamp on the back side of that little ridge. So hose clamp will go right here, and the little ridge from that barb on that hard line is right here. Okay, next I'll go ahead and put two bolts on the bottom of this fuel rail assembly right here and right here, and then it'll be completely bolted up to the intake manifold. If these little holes aren't quite lined up, you may need to adjust how far the hard line pushes into that rubber fuel line that connects the two assemblies. Okay, now that we have both these bolts installed, we actually have the complete fuel rail and fuel line assembly reinstalled on this intake manifold. So we can go ahead and move on to the next step, which is installing that wiring harness. Alright, we finished step number 3, so I can go ahead and grab my dry erase marker, and I'll put a check by step number 3. Okay, moving right along, we're moving on to step number 4, which is installing that wiring harness. Okay guys, we're making great progress, and this is the next step. We're going to install this section of the wiring loom, or the wiring harness. This is basically the portion of your wiring harness that connects to all the sensors that are on your engine. And to install this sucker on your intake manifold assembly, basically what you want to look for is this plastic section right here. This is actually a protective little hard cover for your wiring harness. It actually helps protect the wires from soaking in the heat from your engine. So you definitely want to retain this plastic part and don't throw it away. And it also helps you orient the wiring harness when you install it on these intake manifolds. So take a look at the curves and the bends in this little section, and then go ahead and line up the holes with this little cover with the holes on the bottom of that intake manifold. We're going to start by flipping that intake manifold assembly over so we can get access to the bottom of it. Okay, then you want to grab that wiring harness, you want to lay it down. There's actually only one way that it lines up with all those holes, so line up those holes and go ahead and install those bolts. Alright, we finished installing the wiring harness, so I'm going to bust out my dry erase marker. I'm going to mark off that step. Step number 4 is actually done. So we can now move on to step number 5, which is installing those fuel injectors. I've actually already installed the fuel rails, so there's no need to worry about those. Okay guys, so the next step is to install these fuel injectors and these fuel rails. And the first thing I'm going to mention is anytime you're going to store your fuel injectors, store them in some kind of plastic bag that's dust proof, because these fuel injectors really need to be completely free of any contamination when you install them. Now if you take a closer look at these fuel injectors, you're going to see that there's actually 3 rubber gaskets or O-rings on this injector. And anytime you're going to pull an injector and replace an injector, it's definitely a good idea to replace all the rubber components on that injector. It's a really simple and easy maintenance thing to do when you have these injectors out, and I highly recommend it. And that's what I have right here. This is actually a little injector seal kit, and it comes with all the little replacement O-rings you need and a little packet of lubricant. Okay, here's a close-up of that lubricant they gave. It's called Super Lube, and you basically want to apply a thin coat of this on these O-rings when you install them on your fuel injectors. So I'll go ahead and grab the first injector, take this bottom one off, get rid of that one. This sucker's really hard and really brittle. I'm sure you guys can probably hear that. See how hard that is? That's how brittle that little O-ring is. That sucker's really brittle. I'll go ahead and grab one of these new ones. Look how easy I can squeeze this sucker. You can see how easy I can squeeze it. That kind of shows the degree of elasticity it has. Okay, so that's enough of that, messing around with that. Put a little bit of this lubricant on it. Should probably have some nitrile gloves on. Make sure this sucker's clean. It's pretty clean, and I'll go ahead and slide that on the fuel injector. We're still going to replace this seal and this little tiny O-ring seal. Alright, to remove these seals, just go ahead and slide them off. They should come off. They might be a little bit sticky, but they should come right off. That's that first seal. That sucker's off. And for this one, you just kind of get your thumbnail in there and try to peel that sucker off. Sometimes they're a little bit of a pain. Alright, and there's that little sucker. So go ahead and replace this sucker too. Make sure you lube the sucker up, and then go ahead and slide it over that fuel injector. Alright, there we go. That sucker's all the way on. My finger's got a little bit of lube on them right now, so I can just kind of lube it up like that. And go ahead and slide that little O-ring on the top. And boom. Should slip right into that little groove. Okay, and there we go. This fuel injector's good to go. It's got all new seals and it's ready to be installed. Okay guys, I'm going to walk you through installing these fuel injectors on the right side fuel rail. Now to make it easier for you guys, I'm actually going to flip this intake manifold over, but if you're going to change your fuel injectors in your car, you definitely can do it with the intake manifold right side up. This way, with the intake manifold upside down, I think you guys can actually get a better view of how you slide these injectors into these fuel rails. We're going to slide this side with a small little O-ring into this little hole in your fuel injector rail. And then this side, with that large donut O-ring, that's the side that we're going to slide into that hole in your TGVs. Okay, so basically what you want to do is you want to just kind of twist it back so you can get it in there, and then slide that sucker in, rotate it out, and just kind of line it up with the hole. And we'll do the same thing for this next one. We'll just kind of get it totally perpendicular. Try to make sure you slide this in perpendicular and just slide it into the hole. Shouldn't take a whole lot of effort. Okay, I'm going to flip it over and we'll go ahead and bolt these suckers down. Okay, and the factory spec for torquing these bolts down is actually 13.7 foot-pounds. So go ahead and grab your torque wrench and torque these bolts down. They're holding your fuel rail to your tumble generator valves to 13.7 foot-pounds. Okay, at this point you can go ahead and tighten up all your bolts, tighten everything down at this point, and then you want to go ahead and take that wiring harness and weave it around and start installing it at a bunch of your locations where you can actually connect it to your sensors. And that includes these sensors right here. These are part of your tumble generator valves, this one right here and this one right here. And then of course you can connect your fuel injector sensors as well, right here and right here. And in addition to those sensors and fuel injectors, you can also go ahead and connect any ground terminals. This terminal right here actually gets bolted down to the intake manifold right here. These two plugs are actually going to plug into your coil packs, which sit on top of your valve covers. So don't worry about connecting these yet. We'll connect these after this whole intake manifold assembly is installed on the engine. And the same goes for these. Don't worry about connecting these at this time. We'll connect these once the intake manifold is installed back in the engine. Alright guys, we're done with step number 5, so I'm going to bust out my dry erase marker. I'm going to go ahead and put a check by number 5. And we're going to go ahead and move on to step number 6, which is installing all the evaporative lines and that little purge solenoid. Okay, so here's all the components for your evap system. You actually have your purge solenoid, and you have your one-way check valve, and I'm going to walk you guys through how to install these suckers right now. It may seem like a whole bunch of hoses, but once you've seen it installed, it's actually pretty straightforward. If we're going to start with this sucker right here, this is that purge solenoid, and it actually has a little sensor that plugs into your ECU. When you go to install this sucker, you can actually use this little cutoff section right here, or asymmetrical little wedge section that's cut off, and that's the side that actually lines up with that little slot where you bolt it in, which is actually right here on the bottom of the intake manifold. So go ahead and get that sucker lined up and then snug that bolt down. Once it's installed, it should be at this like 45-degree cocked angle. Okay, and this first hose that's stepping down to that 1/4-inch hose size, that one's going to go down along the bottom and then turn up right here to connect to that T-fitting that's going into that fuel vapor line right here. And this other hose, this hose actually connects right here to this port on your intake manifold. And you can go ahead and connect it like that. Okay, and then you want to take that other piece that has that one-way check valve and that 3-way little T, which as you can see on mine is actually broken. The little 1/4-inch port on my little 3-way T-fitting actually broke off, so I've actually ordered a new one of these suckers, and it's pretty common because these plastic parts and these rubber hoses actually see a lot of heat cycling. That actually causes them to get hard and get brittle over time, so it's pretty common to have to replace all these parts. And when you order a new one of these little 3-way T-fittings, it actually comes with all the little molded hoses as well. So I'm going to go ahead and replace all these little molded hoses and that 3-way T-fitting. But for right now, I'm going to walk you guys through installing it, and then we're going to go ahead and install this intake manifold on the engine. One of the things you can actually look for on this little one-way check valve is there's a little arrow on the top that says to and then E/G. That arrow should actually be pointing to your air intake. So this molded hose is actually going to connect to one of those ports on that factory air intake. And if we rotate it there's actually a little 1/4-inch fitting on the back side. That 1/4-inch fitting actually connects right here to your intake manifold. And then this side, this little blue fitting, this should be a 3-way fitting, but it actually has a little nipple broken off. This little 3-way fitting actually goes down here on the bottom, so connect that blue T-fitting into that fuel vapor recovery hose, and then connect this smaller 1/4-inch little size hose to that smaller little port on this T-fitting, just like this. And that smaller port should rotate down so that this hose can connect right into that smaller port on the bottom. And then you can go ahead and connect this little small 1/4-inch port right here. And this port connects right here to your air intake, like that. Okay, and that evap system is completely installed, and this intake manifold is actually ready to be installed back on this EJ-205 engine. Alright, with the installation of those evap lines and that purge solenoid, we're going to go ahead and knock step 6 off that list. So this intake manifold assembly is completely reassembled. We're going to go ahead and install this sucker back on the engine. Okay guys, anytime you're going to reinstall an intake manifold back on your engine, you're going to want to use new gaskets. And these are the gaskets for this 2005 WX. There's the Subaru part number right there. I'm using OEM gaskets, but really it doesn't matter too much. You can use any kind of gasket you find at your local parts store. And then these are all 8 of the original bolts. And as you can see, a lot of these bolts are actually pretty corroded. On the threads right here at the tip, they got a little bit of white corrosion, and you definitely want to clean that up with a brass wire brush. And on this side, on the head, they don't actually look too great. I'll show you right now one of the other ones I've already cleaned up a little bit. The one you're looking at on the left, I actually just hit up with a wire brush for 3 or 4 minutes. And I'll kind of rotate it to the side so you can see the side profiles too. So that's what it looks like when you hit it up with a wire brush. Just kind of knock off all the oxidation and clean up that surface. So I'll go ahead and clean up the rest of these bolts, and then we'll use them to install this intake manifold. Okay, all 8 of these bolts are totally cleaned up with that brass wire brush. So I'm going to go ahead and grab one of my new intake manifold gaskets, drop it on the engine, and install this intake manifold. Okay guys, so we're finally ready to go. We've got the intake manifold completely assembled, we've got the new gaskets dropped on the engine, and I've cleaned up the threads on the old bolts. That way, when we torque these bolts down, they'll actually be torqued to the correct factory settings, which is around 18.1 foot-pounds. Now the trick here is actually to kind of bend this hose so it's straight up and vertical. And while you bend it, you kind of slip this intake manifold up and over that little hose. And that, guys, is how you get this intake manifold dropped onto this engine. You actually have to bend this hose so it's up vertical slightly, and then you can weave this hose through these 2 runners of your intake manifold while you drop it down onto those gaskets, and then get it lined up with those bolt holes, and then drop those bolts in and torque them down to 18.1 foot-pounds. Okay guys, we're on the left side of the engine, and there's actually 4 bolt holes that hold the intake manifold down on this side. There's one right here, there's one right here, there's one right here, and there's one back here. So go ahead and drop those bolts in and lightly snug them down before I torque them down to that 18.1 foot-pounds. Okay, and it's the same thing on the right side. We have 4 bolt hole locations, one here, one here, one here, and then one right here. And when you torque these suckers down, you're going to want to start from the inside and work your way out. That's a good general rule of thumb anytime you're going to torque down 2 machine surfaces together. Alright, that's 18.1, 18.1, 18.1, 18.1. Alright, and then you can also start connecting all these miscellaneous hoses and sensors. This is part of the PVC system. We can connect that sucker now. like that. And then we can come over here to the front, we can connect our oil pressure sensor. That's this little plug. And that just has a little single blade connection. And then this plug right here, this connects to this sensor right here, and that's your coolant temperature sensor. So go ahead and plug that guy in too. Push him all the way in until he snaps. And you know you've got it fully seated. Okay, and then this sensor right here, that's that little purge solenoid that we installed earlier. So reconnect that guy. And then this one, this actually connects to your crankshaft position sensor. And that's the sensor right down here below. So connect that guy as well. And make sure it's fully seated, locked in place. So we have our crankshaft position sensor, we have our coolant temperature sensor, and we have our oil pressure sensor. And then we can move over here, and this is our camshaft position sensor. We can actually connect the terminal to that guy as well. And that's this terminal right here. So go ahead and connect that sensor. Boom, done. These big plugs, these are our main harness plugs that connect once the engines drop back into the vehicle. So don't worry about these plugs at this time. These plugs actually go to our coil packs. And those I don't have installed yet, but you definitely want to install those before you drop this engine back in your car. And just like that, this intake manifold is back on this engine, and this engine is really starting to come along and starting to look like a fully assembled engine. I'm stoked, guys. This thing's getting really close to being dropped back into my 1998 r-sti coupe, and I hope you guys will join me for those future videos. I'm gonna wrap it up here for today, guys. Thank you so much for checking out the video. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions or any comments, please leave them in the comment section below. If you liked the video, please go ahead and give it a like. And if you think this video would be good for your friends in the Subaru community, please go ahead and click the link and share it with them. Thanks again for checking out the video, guys. I really appreciate it. Thanks for joining me in my little Subaru-only shop here in Northern California. My name's Luke. This is the Subaru-only channel. Until next time, guys. Later! Thanks again for watching this video, guys. As you guys know, I'm a diehard Subaru enthusiast. And I've also had the opportunity to be involved in motorsports for over 2 decades now. But I'm also a professional hydrogeologist, and I've actually spent years in laboratories performing experiments where I studied the flow of fluids using the properties of physics and fluid mechanics. In these YouTube videos, I'm actually able to combine my experience from the laboratories and all the research I've done with my experience from all the motorsport series I've been involved in and my passion for Subarus. If you have any professional inquiries about Subaru-related R&D or digital marketing and media, you can contact me at SubaruONLYshop@gmail.com. Or if you work in private industry or for a public municipality and you'd like to contact me for professional environmental or engineering and design services, you can review my professional academic background, my professional research experience, and my professional consulting experience on LinkedIn. Just go ahead and sign into LinkedIn and look for Luke Shannon and then type TRC. That's the company I currently work for, and if you type Luke Shannon and TRC, I'm the only person that's going to come up. Thanks for checking out the video, guys. I really appreciate it. I hope to hear from you soon.